Something walks past my house every night at exactly 3:03. You'd think that after living here for years, I'd have grown used to it. But the truth is, the nightly visit unsettles me every time. It starts faintly, almost like a distant wind blowing through the trees. But it's not the wind. It's the eerie, soft whistle that creeps along the street. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our road, whistling a repetitive tune. Its pattern is familiar as it is strange. The sound begins from the direction of the Carson house at the end of the street, a low da-da-dum-dum, rising in volume as it approaches my home, before fading again into the distance. When I was younger, my sister and I would sometimes sneak into the kitchen to listen. We'd stifle giggles, half scared, half thrilled. But one thing was always clear, the one rule: never look. Our parents, especially Dad, made that part very clear. Don't look outside when it walks by, he'd say every night before bed, his voice tense in a way that made my skin crawl. Don't peek. I didn't know why, not really. My friends in the neighborhood had similar experiences. Their parents told them the same thing. We all accepted it as one of those strange rules that adults insist on without explanation. And just like that, it became another part of our lives. Until recently, it had never bothered me. I couldn't even hear it from my bedroom upstairs. But things began to change after my sister, Nola, got sick. We'd moved to this house to be closer to the hospital for Nola's treatments. At the time, she was too weak to leave the hospital, her small body tethered to a machine that did the breathing for her. We were told she might never come home, and then one day the doctors announced that she was improving. Miraculously, the neighbors called it a blessing. Another one of the good things that seemed to happen around here. No one could explain why, but ever since we moved in, good things just seemed to happen to us and the other families in the neighborhood. A promotion at work, a streak of good weather, gardens blooming twice as bright. It was as if the very air in this place was enchanted. But the good things were balanced with the bad. The whistler, whatever it was the bad thing. The welcoming committee warned us about it when we first arrived. 4 of our neighbors brought a casserole and a folder of documents to our front door. I'd heard them talking to my parents, their voices hushed and serious. They gave us the same warnings everyone else got. The whistling would happen every night at 3:03, and under no circumstances were we to look outside when we heard it. Some people look, they said, their voices low, and those people are never the same. Mom brushed it off at first, laughed about the silly local superstition. But Dad didn't. He went out that night, bought thick canvas blinds for every window in the house, and installed locks on them. I didn't realize how scared he was until a few years later when I caught him sitting up late at night on the couch, holding Nola tightly as the whistling floated by. He looked pale, his eyes wide, watching the windows like they might burst open at any second. He never looked outside, though. Not once. I was grateful for that. Life continued on normally, or as normal as it could with the nightly visits. Nola's health continued to improve. She grew stronger, able to run and play just like other kids her age. The hospital visits stopped, and the doctors were amazed at her recovery. But there was always the whistling, and then something happened. The night I'll never forget. Our new neighbors, the Robinsons, moved in next door. They seemed like a nice enough family, a couple with a young son named Holden. Holden was a year younger than me and Nola, but we quickly became friends. The first night he stayed over, we tried to scare him with stories of the whistler. But Holden wasn't scared. He was curious. "Why don't we just look?" he asked, his voice casual as we huddled together in the living room, the dim light of the TV casting eerie shadows on the walls. "It's probably nothing." Nola and I exchanged a glance. "You can't," I said, trying to sound firm but feeling my voice shake. "If you look, bad things happen." Holden snorted. "That's just something parents say to scare you. I bet it's just some old guy messing around." I didn't argue, couldn't. But as the clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., my heart began to race. We were supposed to be in bed, but instead we sat there, listening to the minutes tick by. At exactly 3:03, the whistling started. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. It was closer than usual, louder. I couldn't help it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I grabbed Nola's hand. We both stared at the locked window, the sound creeping ever closer. Holden, on the other hand, stood up. He looked at us, grinning. "I'm going to see what it is," he said. "No!" Nola hissed, clutching my arm tighter. But Holden wasn't listening. He grabbed the key to the blinds from the kitchen counter, the one Dad thought he kept hidden, and before we could stop him, he unlocked the latch and pulled the blinds open. The whistling stopped instantly. Holden stood there, frozen, staring out into the night. His smile faded, his eyes wide with shock. And then, in the dim light of the street lamps, I saw something moving. A shape, tall and thin, standing just beyond our yard. I couldn't see its face. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, like it was staring at Holden through the glass. There was a flicker of motion, something like a smile, though it was too dark to tell. Holden's voice cracked. What is that?" I grabbed his arm and yanked him back, slamming the blinds shut. For a moment, nothing happened. We stood there, breathing heavily, the room silent except for the sound of our pounding hearts. And then the knocking started. The knocking was slow at first, deliberate. It echoed through the house, making the walls tremble. Holden stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the couch, his face pale. I pressed myself against the wall, my back cold against the plaster as the sound grew louder. "Knock! Knock! Knock! What's happening?" Holden whispered, his voice trembling. His eyes darted from the window to the door and back again. Nola clung to my side, her small hands trembling against mine. "We should have listened," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The knocking stopped for a moment, the silence stretching, thick and oppressive. I could hear Holden's ragged breathing, his chest heaving. For a second, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe, just maybe, whatever had been out there was gone. But then the sound came again. This time it wasn't a knock. It was a scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against wood. Slow, deliberate, scraping up and down the front door. Holden's eyes went wide with terror, and I could feel my own pulse quicken in response. I wanted to say something to comfort him, but no words came. What could I say? That it was all a prank? A cruel joke? That would have been a lie, and we all knew it. Something was outside, something wrong, and it wanted in. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The room felt colder, the air thick and hard to breathe. I could see my breath in the dim light of the room, misty and fragile. "We need to wake up Mom and Dad," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. Nola nodded, but Holden just stared at the door, his face pale, his body frozen. I took a step toward the hallway, but before I could move any farther, there was a thud, a loud, bone-jarring thud against the door. The whole house shook with the force of it. Thud. Nola let out a small cry, clutching at my arm. Holden stumbled back, his face going even whiter. What is it?" he stammered. I didn't know, couldn't know. All I knew was that we were in danger. Thud. Another loud crash against the door, louder this time, more desperate, like something was throwing itself against the wood, trying to break through. "Please stop," Nola whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. The house was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. We stood there, waiting, too scared to move or breathe. The minutes ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. No one spoke. No one dared move. And then, from outside, we heard it again. The whistle. Soft at first, almost distant, but growing louder. Closer. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. The sound chilled me to my core. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was everywhere, surrounding us, filling the room with its eerie, repetitive melody. Holden took a step toward the window, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. "No!" I hissed, grabbing his arm and yanking him back. "We need to see what it is," he insisted, his voice cracking with fear. "We need to know." "We don't need to know anything," I whispered back, my grip tightening on his arm. "We just need to stay away from the windows. Don't look." But Holden shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's already seen us," he whispered. Holden's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. "It's already seen us." My skin prickled at the thought, my mind racing to reject it, but deep down I felt it too. The oppressive, watchful presence outside the house, waiting. The whistle echoed again, faint and melodic, seeping through the walls like a ghost. I pulled Holden away from the window with a rough jerk, harder than I meant to. "We can't let it in," I whispered fiercely, my voice barely audible above the deafening silence. "Whatever it is, we don't let it inside." Nola, pale and trembling, had her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clutching at her stuffed rabbit with a white-knuckled grip. The soft tune outside persisted, rising and falling in a maddening loop, tugging at something primal inside me, like a hypnotic chant coaxing us into a trance. "Stay here," I whispered, barely able to force the words past my dry throat. "I'll get Mom and Dad." I took one step toward the hallway, but the instant I moved, the whistle stopped. Everything went deathly silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the wild thumping of my heart. Holden and Nola didn't move, didn't speak. Felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. And then, knock, a single knock at the window. We all froze, eyes darting to the source. There, at the living room window, the one Holden had tried to peek through, was a silhouette. A figure standing impossibly still, its head slightly tilted. We couldn't see its face through the thick canvas blinds, but it was there, unmistakably, its shadow cast long and crooked against the faint light of the street lamps outside. The knock came again, softer this time, like it was testing the boundaries, waiting for permission to enter. I swallowed hard, inching back toward Nola. She buried her face in my arm, trembling, but Holden. He was staring at the window, transfixed. His eyes wide and hollow, as if something in him had cracked. "It's just a person," he whispered, his voice faint and distant. "It's just someone." I shook my head, heart pounding in my chest. "No, it's not." Knock, knock, a slow, rhythmic tapping. It echoed in the quiet room, each knock dragging out the silence between us. "Holden," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to wake up my parents. Now." But Holden wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked on the window, his breathing shallow. He took a slow step forward, his hand reaching out as if in a trance. What if we just talk to it? What if it's trying to? "No!" I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back, harder this time. He let out a small yelp of pain, but it was enough to break his focus. The knocking stopped, and then the doorknob rattled. The front door, just across the room, twisted with a slow, deliberate motion. The old wood creaked, the metal of the latch squealing softly. It was trying to get in. It was inside the screen door. "Dad!" I screamed, panic finally taking over. "Dad! Wake up!" I heard footsteps thundering down the hall, but they felt too slow, too distant. My dad burst into the living room, baseball bat in hand, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "What the hell is going on?" Bang! The front door shook violently, like someone or something had thrown its entire weight against it. The doorknob rattled wildly now, as if the thing outside was growing frustrated. My dad didn't hesitate. He rushed to the door, gripping the bat tighter. He motioned for us to stay back, and I pulled Nola and Holden close to me, huddling in the far corner of the room. Another violent bang shook the house. My mom was there now, her face pale, clutching Nola close. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The Whistler," I choked out, barely able to speak. "Holden," he looked. My dad's eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. He turned back to the door, the wood creaking ominously as it strained against whatever was outside. The knocking stopped. The rattling stopped. For a second, I thought it might be over. Then, a voice. From the other side of the door, soft and sickeningly familiar. I heard my own voice, distorted but unmistakable. "Let me in," it said. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I clutched Nola tighter, my pulse racing. My dad took a step back from the door, his knuckles white around the bat. Again, my voice. No, something using my voice. Whispered from outside. It's cold out here. Let me in. No, Nola whimpered, hiding her face in Mom's chest. The door trembled, the sound of slow, steady breathing coming from the other side. Heavy, unnatural breathing, like a wet rasp through hollow lungs. And then, slowly, the voice changed. It wasn't mine anymore. It was Nola's. Daddy, the voice crooned. It's so cold. Let me in. My dad's grip tightened on the bat, but he didn't move. I could see the horror etched across his face. The same terror I was feeling mirrored in his eyes. The voice continued, shifting again, becoming my mother's this time. Please, honey, it begged. It's just me. Just let me in. My mom's breath hitched, her arms tightening around us. She shook her head violently. Don't listen, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. It's not us. Don't listen to it. The thing outside let out a low, guttural moan, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of it pressing against the door, like it was about to break through. Then, without warning, it spoke again, this time in a voice none of us recognized. The voice was slow, hollow, and dripping with malice. You can't hide from me. A loud crash echoed through the house as something slammed against the door with brutal force. My dad flinched, but he didn't move. The door rattled again, the wood groaning under the strain. You can't hide, the voice repeated, each word heavier than the last. Suddenly, the blinds in the room snapped open. All of them, the locks, the latches, everything gave way at once. I spun around just in time to see the canvas blinds whip up, revealing the dark windows, each one framed by the moonlit night beyond. And there, standing outside every window in the house, was a shape, a shadow, tall and twisted, with limbs too long, too thin, standing perfectly still. And they were all looking in. A collective gasp escaped from us, our terror suffocating the air. I pulled Nola closer, burying her face in my chest. My dad was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the deafening roar of my own panic. All I could see were the figures, the tall, distorted things peering through every window, their outlines shifting in the moonlight, moving but never moving, just staring, waiting. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. The sudden blackness was suffocating, pressing in from every corner of the room. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My dad's voice echoed in the dark, low and urgent. Get to the hallway, now. I clutched Nola tighter and stumbled blindly toward the hall, Holden right behind us. We moved as fast as we could, guided only by the faint glimmer of moonlight still filtering in through the windows. The figures outside didn't move, didn't flinch. They were just there, watching. My mom fumbled for the hallway light switch, her hands shaking, but nothing happened. The power was out. The house was silent, save for the sound of our ragged breathing. Stay together, Dad ordered, his voice strained. We'll be fine. We just need to. Thud. A heavy, deliberate step echoed from upstairs. All of us froze. Another step. It was inside. Dad, I whispered, my voice trembling. My dad raised the bat, his eyes locked on the stairway that led to the second floor. The sound of footsteps continued, slow and heavy, coming closer. Holden whimpered behind me, his hand clutching my shirt. It's coming, he whispered. It's coming for us. The air in the house grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath hanging in front of me like mist. My dad took a step forward, his grip tight on the bat. Stay here, he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear I saw in his eyes. He didn't get far. Before he could reach the stairs, the sound stopped. The footsteps halted. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. Why did you look? It was a whisper, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't coming from the stairs. It was coming from right behind us. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, in the doorway to the living room, was one of the figures. Its shadow stretched impossibly long, its head still tilted at that unnatural angle. It was inside, and it was watching us. "Why did you look?" it repeated, the words dragging out, low and distorted. Its body shifted in the moonlight, limbs twitching unnaturally as it moved closer. My dad swung the bat. He didn't hesitate, but the bat never made contact. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, the bat passed right through it, like it wasn't even there. My dad stumbled back, eyes wide. What are you?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, silent, staring. And then it smiled. It wasn't a smile in the way people smile. It was a slow, deliberate stretching of its face, its lips pulling back, revealing too many teeth. Teeth that were sharp and jagged, glistening in the dim light. Holden screamed. The scream shattered the air, jolting us all into motion. My dad grabbed my mom, pulling her toward the stairs. I pushed Nola in front of me, Holden stumbling after us, his face pale and eyes wild. But the figure didn't follow. It just stood there, smiling that horrible, twisted smile, its body flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door to my parents' bedroom behind us. My dad pushed a dresser in front of it, his face pale and drenched with sweat. The figures weren't gone. They were still outside, watching through every window, their silhouettes shifting and swaying in the moonlight, like dancers caught in a slow, twisted waltz. "Why did you look?" The voice came again, this time from the window. Holden collapsed on the floor, his body shaking violently. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to." But the thing outside didn't care. It just kept staring, its mouth twitching into that unnatural grin. And then, slowly, it began to move toward the house again. This terrifying night would not be the last, but it would leave scars on us all. The price of looking was not just the shadows, not just the figures, but something far deeper. The Whistler's song was a warning. Those who defied it, like Holden, would carry its mark forever. Some things were not meant to be seen. The sound of the figures moving outside filled the air, a faint shuffling, like leaves scraping against pavement, punctuated by soft, deliberate knocks at the windows. They were circling us, drawing closer with every second. I huddled next to Nola, trying to keep her calm, but I was shaking too. We were all shaking. Even Dad, who had always been the calm one, the protector, was pale with fear. His hands trembled as he gripped the bat, but we both knew it wouldn't help. Not against these things. The knocking came again, louder now at the bedroom window, and then a voice, that same hollow, distorted voice, repeating the question that had been haunting us. "Why did you look?" Holden was on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He curled into himself, clutching his knees to his chest. His eyes were wide, staring at the window where the figures loomed, shadows against the moonlight. "I'm sorry," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The voice responded, soft and insistent. "You should not have looked." I felt Nola tense beside me, her little fingers digging into my arm as she pressed herself against me, hiding her face. The air in the room felt thick, like we were suffocating. Cold sweat dripped down my spine. "We need to get out of here," Dad muttered, glancing toward the door. "We can't stay trapped in this room." But where could we go? Every exit led back to those things. They were everywhere, at the windows, at the doors surrounding the house. Watching, waiting. I could feel their eyes on us even now, though I couldn't see their faces. It was like they were inside my head, their presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, the sensation unbearable. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do they want?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the window, his jaw clenched, his face set in grim determination. He had no answers. None of us did. Holden's sobs grew louder, more frantic, and I watched as he began to claw at his face, his nails digging into his skin as if he were trying to scratch something away. "I didn't mean to look," he cried. "I didn't mean to." My mom rushed to his side, grabbing his hands and pulling them away from his face. "Holden, stop. Stop it." She pleaded, her voice shaking. But he didn't stop. He was hysterical now, his eyes wild and unfocused, staring through us as if we weren't even there. He was mumbling, incoherent, his words dissolving into sobs. "It's too late," he kept saying. "It's too late. I'm sorry." And then suddenly the knocking stopped. The room plunged into silence so deep, so absolute. It was as if the world had stopped breathing. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat louder than the last. No one moved. No one dared to. We waited. Then the doorknob to the bedroom twisted. A slow, deliberate turn. My dad leapt to his feet, gripping the bat tighter, his eyes locked on the door. He didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was outside the room, it was inside the house now. The knob turned again, this time with more force, like someone or something was testing the strength of the lock. I could feel my breath hitch in my throat as the door shook under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We all stared at the door, holding our breath. I was sure I could hear the faintest sound of breathing on the other side, low and raspy, like air being sucked through cracked lips. My skin crawled at the sound. "Stay away from the door," Dad whispered, motioning for us to move back. We backed up slowly, inching toward the far side of the room, as far away from the door as we could get. Holden was still mumbling to himself, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were in some kind of trance. Then, without warning, the door handle began to shake violently, as if something was furiously trying to break through. The entire door rattled on its hinges, the wood groaning under the strain. The dresser Dad had pushed in front of it trembled, but it held, barely. A loud thud echoed through the room, followed by another, and another. The thing outside was pounding on the door now, slamming its weight against it with enough force to make the walls shake. And then it stopped again. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. I held my breath, waiting for the next attack. Then, from the other side of the door, we heard it. A low, guttural sound. A voice. But this time, it wasn't asking why we looked. It was singing. The same tune we'd heard night after night. The same eerie melody that had haunted our dreams. But now, it wasn't just whistling. It was humming, soft and slow, like a lullaby. Da-da-da-da-da-doom. The sound crawled under my skin, wrapping around my thoughts like a vine, suffocating me. It was maddening, that constant, repetitive tune, as if the thing outside was taunting us. Dad gripped the bat tighter, his face set in grim determination. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here." "But where do we go?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "It's everywhere. They're everywhere." Dad's eyes darted toward the window, then back to the door. "The back door," he said. "We make a run for it. Now, before it tries to get in again." I felt a surge of panic at the thought of leaving the room, of going outside where the figures waited. But what choice did we have? We couldn't stay here. Not with that thing trying to break through the door. "Okay," I whispered, swallowing hard. "Okay. Let's go." Dad grabbed the dresser and slowly pushed it aside, careful not to make too much noise. The door remained still, the knob quiet now. Whatever was outside had stopped trying to get in. We moved toward the hallway, sticking close together. Holden was still out of it, mumbling under his breath, his body trembling. I kept a tight grip on Nola's hand, her tiny fingers cold in mine. As we crept down the hallway, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each step taking us closer to the unknown. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the faint sound of breathing, ours and something else, something distant but near. When we reached the back door, Dad paused, his hand hovering over the handle. He looked back at us, his eyes full of uncertainty. "Stay close," he whispered. "Whatever happens, don't stop running." We all nodded, fear gripping our hearts like a vice. Then Dad flung the door open. The cold night air rushed in, biting at my skin, and for a moment, I thought we might be safe. But then I saw them, the figures. They stood in the yard, their long shadows stretched out in the moonlight, surrounding the house. They were everywhere, too many to count. Their bodies tall and thin, their faces obscured by the darkness. But I could see their eyes, glowing faintly in the night, watching us. And they were smiling. A sound escaped from my throat, half sob, half scream, and I felt Nola's grip tighten on my hand. Dad pushed us forward, his voice low and desperate. Run! We bolted out the door, sprinting toward the fence at the edge of the yard. The figures didn't move at first. They just stood there watching us with those glowing eyes. But as we ran, I could hear them behind us, moving. Their footsteps soft but deliberate, like they were toying with us. Faster! Dad yelled, his voice strained with panic. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Nola's hand slipped from mine, but I grabbed her again, pulling her along. We reached the fence, but before Dad could lift Nola over, one of the figures appeared in front of him. Just there, as if it had always been standing in our path. It smiled at him, that same horrible, twisted smile, and I saw Dad's face go pale. Stay back, he shouted, swinging the bat with all his might. The bat passed through the figure like smoke. It didn't flinch, didn't move. The smile just grew wider. And then, without warning, it lunged. It was so fast. Too fast. The figure's long, thin arms reached out, grabbing Dad by the shoulders. His touch was wrong, unnatural. Like ice and fire at the same time, burning and freezing. Dad let out a strangled cry, dropping the bat as he tried to pull away, but the figure held him tight. I watched, frozen in terror, as the thing bent its head down toward him, its mouth inches from his ear. It whispered something I couldn't hear, and then it stepped back, letting him go. Dad staggered, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, I thought he might collapse. But then he turned to us, his expression blank, like all the life had been drained from him. Run, he whispered. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Dad, run, he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. I grabbed Nola's hand and ran. We made it over the fence, barely. I heard Holden stumble behind us, his sobs growing louder, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. The figures were still there, still watching, their eyes glowing in the dark. We ran into the woods behind the house, the trees closing in around us, the darkness swallowing us whole. The sound of footsteps followed us, soft and steady, like the figures were walking alongside us, always just out of sight. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out. Nola collapsed next to me, gasping for breath. What was that? She whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that we were alone now, lost in the woods with those things still out there. Watching, waiting. Holden stumbled up beside us, his face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, he whispered again. I didn't mean to look. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We stayed there in the dark, huddled together, listening to the distant sound of whistling, soft, slow, and relentless. We never saw Dad again. The figures left eventually, fading back into the night like they had never been there. But the memory of them stayed, haunting us, filling every quiet moment with dread. The Whistler came every night at 3:03, as it always had. But we never looked again. We never dared. Nola and I moved away not long after, leaving the house, the neighborhood, and the Whistler behind. But no matter where we went, I could still feel it. That creeping presence. The watching eyes. The price of looking was too high. Holden never recovered. His family moved away soon after the night it all happened. I heard rumors, whispers among the neighbors, that they didn't last long after that. Tragedy after tragedy followed them. A million little misfortunes, stacking up one after another until there was nothing left of them. That's the price of looking. The Whistler still comes every night. Wherever I am, wherever we go, I can hear it. 3:03. Da 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 doom. I don't look anymore. I just listen and wait.